In a surprising move, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has dismissed his Home Secretary Suella Braveman. For weeks, Ms. Braverman had been openly challenging the Tory government's stance on immigration and mass deportation. The breaking point occurred when she authored an article last week for The Times in London. In that piece, she ended up accusing the Metropolitan Police of double standards. Her allegations included the claim that the police were lenient on pro-Palestinian protesters, while at the same time being harsh on right-wing demonstrators who were agitating in support of Israel. There was a lot of religious dog whistling in that article, to which 10 Downing had sought some modifications. But Braverman refused, the article was published, and the protests and counter-protests happened over the weekend, which happens to be one of the most solemn in Britain, Remembrance Day, which commemorates the signing of the armistice at the end of World War I. But the scenes on London streets at that weekend were far from somber. There were clashes between pro- and anti-Palestine groups, resulting in the detainment of over 100 individuals. Privately, law enforcement officials informed the government that Ms. Braverman's words were exacerbating tensions. It was like adding fuel to the fire. Technically, she, as the boss of the Metropolitan Police, instead of dousing the fires and helping the police do their job, was actually fanning them. However, Braverman's dismissal was not the only shake-up in Rishi Sunak's cabinet. The more significant surprise was the appointment of former Prime Minister David Cameron as the new Foreign Secretary. While former Prime Ministers returning to government in lesser roles has happened before, Cameron's comeback is particularly rare. The last time a former Prime Minister returned to the cabinet was more than 50 years ago. Harold Wilson came back to the government after having demitted office as Prime Minister, and that was in 1979. Today, it's 2023. With Braverman out and Cameron in, Sunak is also signalling multiple shifts in the government's direction. Braverman represented a challenge to Sunak's leadership from the hard right faction of the Conservative Party, particularly on issues like immigration. Additionally, she was also a vocal opponent of the India-UK Free Trade Agreement. That was a point of contention since Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, and there have been, 3 Prime Ministers since him? Multiple deadlines had come and gone for the signing of the FTA, but negotiators were simply not able to get it done. With David Cameron's inclusion, Sunak aims to convey a move towards the political centre. David Cameron, known for his compassionate conservatism, offers a more moderate and centre-right alternative to the brash hard-right conservatism that is spearheaded by figures like Braverman and Gov. Cameron is also a big defender of free trade and legal migration, so Sunak will be hoping that David Cameron can get the FTA done. Moreover, Cameron's appointment places a heavyweight in charge of the UK's foreign relations. With personal relationships with global leaders like Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu, David Cameron is likely to command more attention than his predecessors. A Biden or a Netanyahu, or even a Putin for that matter, are likelier to give Cameron their time of day compared to a Braverman or a Cleverly or even a Sunak. It signals that British foreign policy is back in the hands of an adult and someone who is not bent by panderers to the extreme right. Cameron's centrist and internationalist approach, supporting legal migration and free trade, sets a very different tone for the rest of the term of Sunak's government. It will be useful as Britain navigates the contours of the 2 ongoing wars in Gaza as well as in Ukraine. However, David Cameron does face some intense challenges in reconciling his pro-Europe stance during the 2016 referendum. He lost his job basically after misguidedly taking Britain into a referendum on whether to stay or to leave the European Union. And in that referendum, of course, a slender majority of the country voted to leave the EU. David Cameron had campaigned passionately to remain, but he misread the mood of the country. The current leadership of the Conservative Party, from the time of Boris Johnson onwards, has been predominantly pro-Brexit. Cameron will have to reconcile this obvious contradiction. Also, his previous government's austerity cuts were deeply unpopular at that time, that could also pose obstacles. The Labour Party, which is already leading by over 20 percentage points nationwide, could rip into David Cameron's spending cuts from a decade ago. Further, Cameron's advocacy for improved ties with China may be contentious in the current geopolitical environment. Cameron had famously heralded the golden age of China-UK ties, and that seems like a century ago. David Cameron blooded his politics right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a time when globalization was at its peak, the US became the sole superpower in the world, and free trade was the conventional norm. Today, post the age of Trump and post the age of Brexit, when increasingly the West is going insular and anti-free trade, will Cameron's politics from the 90s and the noughties resonate with today's average British voter? On the domestic front, Sunak's move may also be aimed at the so-called blue wall voters. These are constituents of south of London, along the English coast, traditionally which have been conservative strongholds. Recent by-election losses in these areas indicate that moderate Tory voters who were disenchanted with the party's stand on immigration and slogans of "Stop the Boats" were shifting towards the Liberal Democrats. Cameron has done business with the Lib Dems, having run a government, a coalition government, successfully for 5 years before dumping the Lib Dems right before the 2015 election. And that election, Cameron came back to office on the strength of just the Conservative Party. Sunak, by bringing in Cameron and his more centrist conservatism, is hoping to lure back some of these voters back to the traditional values that the Conservative Party stands for: small government and low taxes. In a sense, the reshuffling of Rishi Sunak's cabinet reflects a strategic maneuver, a maneuver to try and consolidate support within the party, present a united Conservative family, and of course, most importantly, appeal to a broader voter base come the 2025 elections. The inclusion of David Cameron symbolizes a departure from the more divisive politics associated with figures like Braverman and Gove, and a return to a more centrist, internationally focused conservatism. Whether or not this gamble pays off for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party as they navigate the complexities of a new Britain, that is something that only the 2025 general election will reveal. But this is going to be an interesting space between now and the next general election.